Hello and welcome to another episode of Peace at Last, the podcast that discusses the latest scientific discoveries in psychology, explains techniques and principles from ancient spiritual traditions, and gives you tools to put them into practice. You can change the way you feel and find peace at last. My name is Fabrice Nye, psychologist, coach, and spiritual explorer. If this podcast speaks to you, you may subscribe on the platform of your choice. I also invite you to share your favorite episode with some of your friends. This is the best way to spread the word and support the podcast. You are listening to episode number 5, and today we're looking at the second group of thinking traps, the arbitrary inferences. We're going to see in a moment what we mean by that. But before we do this, I'd like to thank Dominic Rolla, who left a comment in the show notes of episode 2. Dominic wrote, "Hi Dr. Nye, I'm a longtime follower of Dr. David Burns. It's good to hear your voice again. I receive David's podcast automatically in my inbox. I'm no computer whiz kid. Please tell me exactly how to subscribe to your podcast." And actually, turns out that Dominic figured this out by himself, because he then wrote, "Oh, I figured it out. By the way, the sound quality for your podcast is exceptional. Thank you. It's wonderful to hear all of the initial basics again, like a kind of a refresher course. It should help me continue to be feeling good." So thank you, Dominic. Let me answer the implicit question you left in that comment. If you're listening to this episode, you may already have landed on my website. But if you're not sure, go to peaceatlast.us. You should see the show notes for this episode. At the bottom of the page for the show notes, you should see 3 buttons that take you to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Play Music. There's other platforms where you can subscribe, but there's no buttons for those. So you can select the platform you prefer and subscribe there. If you are using an app on your phone to play your podcasts like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Overcast, iCatcher, Spotify, etc., go to the subscribe screen in that app and search for Peace at Last. You should then be able to subscribe to this podcast. So as of today, after just 4 episodes, Peace at Last has been downloaded over 1,000 times. And this is just from the loyal follower of my old podcast, Feeling Good with David Burns. So thank you so much for your support. I'm sure that the listenership would continue to grow with your help. I've had a couple of comments from people who thought that the content in these episodes was a bit dense. One person even told me that he had to listen to the episode twice to catch everything. I'm hoping to improve this and to add maybe more redundancy in the episodes so that the material stays with you more easily. For today, I was going to go through the rest of the thinking traps, but for the sake of simplicity, I will just stick to the second group of distortions, jumping to conclusions. And I will present the last group in part 3. This way, I'm hoping that the episode will not be too much to digest at once. Keep in mind that you can always refer to the show notes as a refresher, and especially to the handouts that I try to provide at almost each episode. For the thinking traps, I will post a handout recapitulating all the distortions and their possible antidotes at the end of episode 6. I would also like to announce that I will soon begin an email newsletter associated with the podcast. What I would like to do is some interesting or useful information that will arrive directly in your inbox no more than once a week. And my idea is to select one of my favorite quotes and something that's pertinent to the podcast and to write a small blurb about what that quote means to me while tying into some of the material that I'm presenting in the episodes. So if this would be of interest to you, let me know by either leaving a comment in the show notes or by emailing me directly at fabrice@life.net. Or if you think that my idea is lame and would like to propose a much better one, I'd still love to hear from you. So let's look at the next 4 thinking traps, and I'm going to talk about a category that I group under arbitrary inferences. The 4 thinking traps in this group are jumping to conclusions, and the fancy term for that would be inference-observation confusion. The second is fortune-telling. The third is mind-reading. And the fourth is labeling or mislabeling. So let's go through each one in turn. So let's look at jumping to conclusion, which is kind of like an umbrella term for some of the others. So this thinking trap consists of reaching a conclusion that paints things as worse than they really are and going beyond the available evidence. You might say that this describes most of the thinking traps we've seen so far. And I'll say this again, all those thinking traps overlap quite a bit. So if you can't find a specific distortion when you examine a negative thought, this one might be a good candidate. We fall into this trap when we misattribute causes to a situation without having any clear proof, or when we give meaning to a situation without questioning our interpretation. So for example, let's say you've applied for a position and you receive an email from the company with a subject line that doesn't sound very positive. Immediately you imagine that it's a rejection letter. You're feeling already sad, disappointed, dejected, only to discover as you open the email that in fact they want to offer you the position. Your brain had already gone into prediction mode without your consent and made you feel emotions that were based on flimsy data. Another example of poor inference would be to determine your self-worth on the basis of other people's opinions or actions. In the example above, let's say that you did receive a rejection letter. You could be thinking that your skills are not up to date, that you are really incompetent, or that you're just not a good enough person, period. This disregards an infinite number of alternate explanations that may not have anything to do with you at all. When we jump to conclusions, we fail to distinguish between objective, observable facts and the premature conclusions that we have only inferred or assumed. We then make decisions and act with insufficient evidence. A special case of jumping to conclusions is fortune tellings. That's our second thinking trap. That's when we predict what's going to happen in the future in terms of negative outcomes. Some examples might be, I will never get better at this, whatever the this refers to. I'm going to be depressed forever. I'm going to screw up my interview, and so on. In this type of jumping to conclusions, we assume we know the future and we convinced ourselves of it. There's also a dark side to fortune telling because we can set ourselves up for failure. And that prediction can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I'm convinced that I'm going to fail, I will go into the interview or the exam or the dinner date with a negative attitude and some fears, and that will deprive me of the resources that I need to succeed. For example, if I show up at my job interview so anxious about being rejected, I will appear unsure of myself and I will not make a good impression. In addition, another way fortune telling can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy is because we give up before giving it our all. For instance, if I expect to fail my math finals, I'm not going to try very hard. What would be the point? Of course, as a result, I'm much more likely to fail indeed. This will then validate that I was right all along, and leading me to an ever-tightening spiral of low self-confidence. The third thinking trap in this group is mind reading. Now, this is not telepathy. It is assuming that people think negatively about you, even though you don't really know what they're thinking. In this case of jumping to conclusions, you infer a person or a group of persons' thoughts from their behavior or their body language, but even more often from your own totally made-up confabulation. Of course, you tend to assume the worst. For example, this guy's having a dinner date with a woman, and she doesn't seem as enthusiastic or effusive as he thinks she should be. And he's thinking to himself, she thinks I'm stupid. Meanwhile, across the table, she seems to detect that he hesitates to look her in the eye, and she's telling herself, I know he thinks I'm ugly. I should never have worn this dress. Notice that it can easily blend itself with another thinking trap that we've looked at last time, the mental filter. We only pay attention to the potentially negative behaviors. In this example, the pleasant conversation, the very fact that the other person agreed to go out to dinner are all positive signs, but they get discounted in favor of some unclear body language. The fourth and last thinking trap in this group is labeling. That can be referred to as mislabeling also sometimes. Labeling is using a single word or phrase to describe a person, an attitude, or a situation, and typically a derogatory word. It's also a form of overgeneralization because we observe a person's actions and we generalize that to their entire character. And this can apply to ourselves too, of course. Let's say I'm trying to close a deal on a big contract. I'm a salesperson in a company, and I've been working on this contract for a while, and at the last minute, the client pulls out of the deal. I could be saying to myself, I'm a loser, instead of saying, I lost this contract, where I generalize this one event to my entire character and qualifying myself with a single word. So here's some practice on overcoming the tendency to jump to conclusions. The most important thing here is to focus on facts and tangible events. So one approach is examine the evidence. I've described this technique in the previous episode. So bring to mind what you know about the situation, make an inventory. For instance, if you fell into the trap of mistaking your partner's eating the last cookie for selfishness and a lack of love for you, you might recall the many opportunities when your partner acted very generously with you and how often they have demonstrated their love to you. A second approach would be considering the alternate possibilities. In all cases, possible interpretations for a situation are nearly infinite. To overcome our thinking trap, we can think of several different ways of interpreting our situation, beyond the one that seems to cause us grief. In the example above, you could conceive that your partner ate the last cookie because they didn't notice it was the last one, because they thought nobody else wanted it, because they were really hungry and didn't have time to grab another snack, or simply because they had a sugar craving and thought that you'd understand and be the generous one. Another approach would be to keep a don't know mind. This idea of the don't know mind comes from my teacher, Byron Katie. Our intuitive reaction in the face of uncertainty is to resolve it as quickly as possible. But in many cases, if not most, we do not need to interpret what's going on. We can simply take life as it is. We can also recognize that uncertainty is inherent in life, period. We can never know anything for sure. Being willing to accept that uncertainty is part of life and start to feel more comfortable with it will lead to more peace. Another approach is the survey technique. To avoid mind reading, the absolute simplest way to defeat that is to ask people what they think. If, for instance, I give a presentation and I judge my performance pretty poorly, I may also believe that the audience is passing negative judgment on me. To dispel this belief, I have the option of going around talking to the people who attended the presentation and ask them one-on-one whether they thought I messed up my presentation. Chances are, if I'm not a narcissist, that my own judgment is much harsher than that of my colleagues. This technique, of course, must be used judiciously, though. You need to ask people whom you know will have your best interest at heart. Finally, one more technique to overcome the arbitrary inferences, especially as an antidote to labeling, is let's define terms. This is a technique that is used by my mentor, David Burns. If you call yourself a loser, you have to define what loser means. And typically when you do that, you find out that the term either, number one, applies to everyone, and therefore is meaningless. Number two, it may apply to no one, and therefore it's also meaningless. You may find Number 3, that the term does not apply to you and therefore is meaningless in this context. You can find that the term is based on arbitrary standards, in this case yours, and therefore is meaningless, or that it doesn't make sense and therefore is meaningless. So that's the power of defining terms. In the next episode, and the last one of the series on thinking traps, I will publish a handout listing each one of them with possible ways to undistort your thinking. This concludes this episode of Peace at Last. For more information, go to peaceatlast.us, where you'll find the show notes for this episode and future episodes. If you have comments or questions, leave them on the website, or you can email me directly at fabrice@life.net. I may be selecting your question as a topic for a future episode. If you just discovered this podcast, I invite you to subscribe on iTunes or on the platform of your choice. If you like it and want to support it, tell a friend who may not be familiar with podcasting and show them how to subscribe. I also invite you to go to iTunes and leave a review. It will help other people find this podcast. I am Dr. Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join me next time for another episode of Peace at Last.